We're back.
We're back, and we have yet another thing that relates back to this podcast, the idiom of the week. Maybe we should just make it.
Should we just do idioms of the week now for all of our listeners?
I love that idea because I've really been noticing them more and more.
Yes.
Ever since we talked about them,
it's
sticking out to me in conversation.
Yes, sometimes when I'm talking, if I say one, I'm like, wait a minute, where did that come from?
Yes.
Yep. But we did have some listeners mention to us that we say a lot in our episodes that we went down a rabbit hole. And that is true. We do say that a lot. And what is funny is we didn't talk about that phrase at all in our idiom episode.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which I guess I maybe take for granted that one I kind of am familiar with and know where it originated, but maybe not everybody is.
True.
Or you haven't thought about that. But the origin story of Down the Rabbit Hole is Alice in Wonderland.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought it was. But I also thought that maybe Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, was playing on a phrase that already existed. So I think maybe I didn't know if it came specifically from him or if it was like he plays with so many things in those books. I didn't know if he was playing on that.
Yep. No, incidentally, it is the title to the first chapter. And the first chapter is where Alice sees the white rabbit and decides to follow him down his rabbit hole. And that's what takes her to Wonderland. And so after he wrote about that, then it kind of permeated the English vernacular. And now in the 21st century, it's most often used to describe a person who gets lost in research or loses track of time while using the internet.
Womp, womp, womp.
Which is why we say it all the time, because that is the basis of this podcast.
I was going to say, also, it pretty much describes every day in our lives.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Pretty much. So.
There you go.
Yes.
Next time you're going to go down the rabbit hole, you can think of following a white rabbit into a really trippy land.
Yes. Or the Matrix reference, which I mean is
true.
Ultimately a reference back to Alice in Wonderland. But
good call.
Yeah, right? Follow the white rabbit. And also just throwing this out there, but if you haven't read Alice in Wonderland, it's not that long. I highly recommend it. It's an amazing piece of literature and so many little references and plays on words and twists and turns. It's one of my favorites. I really enjoyed it for an old book.
Nice. I also feel like the Disney version cuts out.
Oh my gosh, don't even get me started.
Right. The Jabberwocky. The Jabberwocky's fantastic.
Yeah.
I know.
The book itself is actually very philosophical and smartly written. And I feel like the Disney version is the dumbed down version of Alice in Wonderland, for kids. But Lewis Carroll wrote that book for a child, Alice. So.
And if you want to have a twist, I actually recommend the book Heartless by Marissa Meyer, which is a story about how the Queen of Hearts becomes the Queen of Hearts.
Ooh, okay. I like that. I love a little postmodernism in my literature.
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
And then it gets depressing, but it's also good.
Yeah.
Because she becomes the Queen of Hearts.
Yes, right.
Yep.
There's your idiom of the week that we will probably say at least once in this episode.
Probably. Just wait for it. You could start playing a game. How many times we say it in an episode?
Yeah. I like that. I'm Katie.
And I'm Emily.
We're two long-distance best friends with a passion for learning about all the things that make everyday life interesting.
With my PhD in geography
and my master's in library science,
doing deep dives on topics is our idea of a fun time together. We'll share our findings with you on
Researching the Obvious.
So today's episode, the world is our oyster, and we're focusing on oysters.
Yes.
And this topic was not one of the initial topics I don't think that we thought of, but it is something that I know I personally have done weird amounts of research on.
Yes. Which is why it's also something that we've talked about several times before this. So oysters entered my consciousness when you started doing all of your research.
Yes. And the thing that spurred my oyster research was honestly moving to Baltimore.
Yeah.
Oysters were never a food that really entered my brain, or even, I mean, not even just a food, just a creature that entered my brain. And then when I moved to Baltimore, they're very ubiquitous here, just within my neighborhood. So like a 10-minute walk from my house, I would consider to be my neighborhood. Just within my neighborhood, we have 3 oyster restaurants that I can walk to. Plus also occasionally they'll have what they call buck-a-shuck, which is basically people that bring a giant pail of oysters or whatever and set up a little table, maybe outside of a bar or in a corner of a restaurant or something like that. And you would just pay $1 per oyster for him to shuck you some.
Nice.
So that's also common. And it just wasn't something that I thought about until I lived here and saw it on the daily.
Yeah.
That I started thinking, like, what is the deal with these and why are they everywhere? And then I went to this museum in Baltimore called the Museum of Industry, the Baltimore Museum of Industry. And there's an entire exhibit in this museum dedicated to the oyster industry. And I was like, time out. What is all of this oyster stuff? I'm so just not familiar with this at all. And yeah, so it really just sent me on a path of exploring everything there is to know about oysters.
Yes. Well, and then you also, as a vegetarian, decided to start eating them. So I remember having that discussion with you too, because then when we come and visit you, I was very excited to eat oysters with you, because even though we live in a landlocked state, we enjoy oysters. And then if we're not somewhere that's landlocked, we like to partake of the local seafood. And
yes,
oysters are such a big thing in Baltimore. We really looked forward to that.
Yeah. And we'll get into reasons why I consume oysters later in this episode. But it is true. I feel like I had to, by necessity, share all of my crazy oyster research with you when you came to visit.
Yes. And I also did not anticipate this necessarily being a topic, but since we have been discussing it, when we really started to dig into it, I was shocked by how much information there was on oysters and the history of oysters, also how far back they go. I can start with this little factoid that oysters have been around for over 500 million years, which is crazy to me. They are
like as a species.
Old. Yes. Yes.
That is crazy.
And so back in that time, way, way, way back when, 500 million years ago, they actually haven't evolved that much since then because they're effective at what they do. But the biggest difference was that back then they could be as long as 3 feet and could weigh more than 20 pounds.
No. Oh my God.
Yes. Could you imagine a giant ancient oyster that's just the size of a giant watermelon, bigger than a watermelon?
No, that's crazy.
Yeah. Also gross. I can't imagine eating that, but you know.
What?
So much slime. So much
God.
slime.
Yeah, no. That's crazy. There's also a ton of different species of oysters today, but I just primarily focused on the U.S. oyster industry. And so in the United States, we have 2 major species of oysters. We have the Crassostrea virginica, which is the Atlantic oyster or the Eastern oyster. And then we have the Crassostrea gigas, and that is the Pacific oyster. So the eastern oyster is going to be the one that you find all throughout the Chesapeake Bay, Gulf of Mexico, all the way up into New England and
that's
Nova
all the same
Scotia.
species?
Yep. And then there's the Pacific Coast one, which is the one that's primarily in Washington, Oregon, and parts of Northern California.
Okay. Wow.
So there's only 2 primary species of oysters in the US. And you might be thinking to yourself, that's crazy, because when I go to get oysters, it feels like there's all these different types with different names. And we'll talk about this later, but that just has to do with where they're geographically harvested from. But the species of oyster is the same.
Okay.
And those 2 species of oysters are different from the species of oysters that are found in Europe and in some other places like Japan. So US oysters are different from European and Japanese oysters.
Interesting. So I didn't realize that, well, one, there were only 2 species of oysters here in the US, but then the other areas of the world might have different species.
Mm-hmm.
I did read a little bit as I was looking about how far back oysters go, that oysters were considered a delicacy for the Greek and Roman empires, but they were mostly eaten by the upper class since they were a delicacy.
Mm-hmm.
And the Greeks were the first to actively cultivate oysters. So they would do that by dropping pieces of pottery into the ocean where oysters would grow, wait for them to attach, and then they'd go back and get the pieces of pottery and transplant them to other locations so that they could then harvest them. So I thought that was really interesting, that like that's how long people have been cultivating oysters, even intentionally growing them to eat.
Yeah.
And also, you might be familiar with that image of Aphrodite sitting or standing in a shell. That's an oyster shell, which I didn't know that either. Her myth is that she was born from sea foam and in an oyster.
Is that why we think that oysters are aphrodisiacs, even though that's not a proven thing?
Yes, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, then that gave way to the idea that they were an aphrodisiac. So yes, quite literally tied by the word, which I thought was funny too. Yeah, and people still think that, but like you said, no proven effects there.
That's fascinating.
You can thank Aphrodite for that oyster myth.
Yeah. I would say too, in the US, that oysters were also a wealthy class food until maybe the mid 1800s, which we'll talk about that. But prior to that, they were mostly eaten by wealthy people unless you lived in an area in which they were very abundant, because then they were just there. And then they were just eaten because you could easily collect them. So there's lots of references for Native Americans eating oysters in the East Coast area of the US, and also especially enslaved people who lived in the coastal plains of the Chesapeake and South Carolina and stuff. They would often collect oysters in order to supplement the protein in their diets, because they were given such shitty diets as enslaved people that they would collect oysters and use them as a supplemental easy protein for their diets for a long time. So they were sort of like a high class food, but yet at the same time, if you lived in an area where oysters were abundant, then they were a food for literally everyone.
Yeah, which I thought was really interesting too, because when I was reading about the golden age of oysters, in particular in New York City, there were a lot of references to oysters being the kind of connector of the classes, because everyone was eating them, from the working class people to the higher class or wealthy people. And there were, in fact, some pictures, like some drawings of some of the New York City markets, which were kind of interesting because they pointed out that the markets were one place where you would see those upper class and lower class people come together for things like oysters. So a market was an acceptable place for both wealthy class and lower class people to be, and oysters were one of the main draws of those markets.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and women too. Women were allowed to be at the market. So it was also a big deal for that reason.
Interesting. Well, before we dive into the golden age of oysters, which I feel like is a fascinating topic that I'm excited to share with everyone, maybe we should talk a little bit about how oysters are grown.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what is an oyster?
I was very confused. I was like, I don't understand these things. So I looked it up. So I'll talk a little bit about how they're naturally grown and then how they're harvested today. But in the wild, essentially, there's male oysters and female oysters. And the female oysters will shoot out a bunch of eggs, and the male oysters will shoot out a bunch of sperm that will fertilize the eggs. And then what happens is those fertilized eggs turn into larvae, essentially, that just sort of float around in the water.
Okay. All right.
And those are called the oyster splats. So these splats just are floating around in the water being larvae.
Okay.
Until they're able to latch onto something. And then once one of those larvae latches onto something, then it sticks there, and that's where it stays its whole life. And then that's when it starts building its shell around itself.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Right?
So it's able to create its own shell.
Yes. Like a clam or like a
mollusk.
Anything else, right? Yeah. So yeah, it's in the same kind of category as other, they're called bivalves because they have a bottom shell and a top shell and it hinges.
Yep.
And so once it latches on, it stays there and then builds its shell around itself and just lives there forever, essentially, until it dies or until we take it off of
until we come to steal it and eat it.
Right. But so they don't move. So unlike some other more developed, I would say, bivalves, and I mean developed in terms of more complex species, like a clam or a scallop, oysters don't move. They're the same as mussels, where they just latch onto something and then that's where they live forever, versus clams have their little foot thing that can allow them to move around the ocean floor. So they'll latch on and stick there, and usually it's like onto a rock or something else. Today, when we're harvesting oysters the same way that Greeks and Romans were doing it too, in some cases, essentially what we're doing is just in a tank, we're combining the male oysters and the female oysters and creating that whole tank of splats, oyster splats, and then we're putting those splats into an area that already has a ton of things for the splats to latch onto. So that's a great idea that the Greeks and Romans were using pottery.
Yep.
Today, what a lot of oyster farms use is old oyster shells. So they'll take the old oyster shells and usually ground them up a little bit and then put them back into the farm area, and then the splats will just latch on because they'll already have things to latch onto. So the likelihood of all of them surviving increases because they have things to latch onto.
Gotcha. Reduce, reuse, recycle.
Yeah. So they'll just latch onto those, and then it depends on the farm. Some farms contain them in cages or bags or something else that makes it a lot easier for them to just pull it out to harvest them. Maybe pieces of rope. You've probably seen mussels on
a piece of
those. Rope.
Yep.
Right. So they'll often put them in some sort of container to allow the splats to latch onto that just to make it easier to take them out. Back in, I would say, before the 1900s, we weren't necessarily caging them up. We were collecting them off of rocks or off of the bottom of the ocean floor.
Mm-hmm.
And there were essentially two major ways that we did that. One was with these giant wooden tongs.
Yes, I read about those.
Yeah, they were basically like giant wooden salad tongs. And so people would stand in a shallow boat. Originally, these would have been like hollowed canoes. In the late 1800s in Maryland, the skipjack boat was invented. And that's just a very thin, shallow boat. And so people would be able to easily stand in it and hold these giant tongs and lift the oysters up from the bottom. The other way that people would harvest is by raking. And so they would take a giant rake, essentially, and scrape the oysters off of rocks and other things that they were stuck on. So, we could still harvest those ways today, and some people still rake parts of the ocean to get oysters. But a lot of farms, they're just creating things for the oysters to latch onto so that it's easy to just pull them out. So those are the two main ways that people would traditionally harvest oysters. And so it made it pretty easy from the beginning, really, to ensure that there was oysters for people to eat, because as long as they're dumping something for these splats to latch onto back into an area where they know oysters are living, then more oysters are going to grow, and then you just kind of tong them up or rake them up.
Yeah, and something I didn't realize until I was doing research for this episode is that, I mentioned the golden age of oysters, which is roughly like the 18th into the 19th century. So the reason that there was even a golden age of oysters, and I was particularly reading about New York City, is that when they first settled New York, that oysters were so plentiful, there were 350 square miles of just natural oyster reefs in that area. So much so that it was a hazard that you could run your ship aground on these oyster reefs. Yeah. And in fact, Ellis Island and Liberty Island were sometimes referred to as Little Oyster Island and Great Oyster Island because of the sheer number of oysters that existed around those places. So I think as New York City became more and more of a city, oysters were just a naturally, easily available food source. And there were just so many of them that it made sense to harvest them and to eat them and commoditize them.
Yeah. I was reading too that one of the reasons why oysters started becoming such a popular food source in this golden age, because I was saying earlier that prior to like 1850, it was wealthy people that were eating these, or people that lived in the area. But after the Civil War, that's when we start getting the growth of trains in the US. And the main places where trains were coming from originally was Baltimore, with the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad. And then, of course, New York City as well. And so all of a sudden you had this super abundant food source that existed on the coast, and also a way to fairly quickly ship it across the US. And so the oyster industry grew tremendously. I was reading that it peaked between the years of 1880 and 1910. That's what we're talking about, this golden age of oysters. And we were producing in the US 160 million pounds of oysters per year.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah. And the oyster industry employed more than 52,000 people.
That's crazy too.
I know, especially when you consider the population size of the US at that time.
Yeah.
52,000 people in this industry.
Those big business.
Mm-hmm. And so it became a really cheap protein source, essentially, because there were just so many and they could get them to people a lot quicker.
Yeah, I read that in the mid 1800s, an oyster cost approximately 3 cents a piece, which would be equivalent to about 25 cents today. So, like I was saying before, I think that's also part of the reason that they became so accessible to multiple class levels and to the working class as well as the wealthy class, is that they were cheap. There were so many of them, you didn't have to charge an arm and a leg for it.
And so the production facilities in the US, the main ones that existed back then, obviously New York, New Haven, Connecticut was a huge center for production. And then there was some in the Gulf Coast as well. But the primary location that people were producing oysters in the US was in the Chesapeake Bay area, primarily Maryland and Virginia. And Maryland was on the higher end than Virginia. So at the time when 160 million pounds of oysters were being produced per year, 60%, so more than half of those, like 2/3 almost, were being produced specifically in the Chesapeake region. So really the Chesapeake area was kind of the center for a long time of this oyster production. In 1894, so this is kind of the middle of the golden age of oysters, Maryland oyster fisheries were seen as the most extensive and the most valuable oyster fisheries in the world. And what's also interesting, I thought, is because of the growing demand for oysters all around the country, but especially in New England, that New Haven area, and that's where a lot more population was back at the time, they started depleting their oyster farms fairly quickly. And so what ended up happening is they were taking essentially oyster splats from the Chesapeake and transporting them up to New Haven in order to restock all of the oyster farms up in Connecticut and New England because the Chesapeake had so much. Yeah. And so they were moving 2 million bushels a year of oysters up from the Chesapeake to Connecticut to restock Connecticut.
These numbers are insane.
No, I know. The more I looked into it, I was like, volume. I cannot... Because today I feel like oysters are popular, right? Today, but we do not consume them in these numbers today. And I cannot imagine consuming oysters on these levels.
Yeah.
It's nuts. I was reading that an oyster shucker, like a professional oyster shucker back in the day, would open 4,000 to 5,000 oysters a day.
Oh my God.
To shuck them and pack them up and ship them out to people to eat them.
Wow.
And that's just one person.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot of oysters.
It's so many oysters. The consumption of oysters was so high. And like I said, primarily coming from the Chesapeake area, that Baltimore became the center of this oyster trade because they could easily get all of the oysters from the Chesapeake, process all of them in the oyster shucking facilities that existed in Baltimore, and then put them on the trains and ship them out. And so 30 to 40 train cars a day were leaving Baltimore packed with oysters. Yes, packed with oysters. 30 to 40 cars a day, which is nuts to me. And in the state of Maryland, 33,000 people were involved in the oyster industry. So it was a huge, huge endeavor. People were eating these, like I said, like crazy. One stat I found was for New York City, which you were mentioning how much was in New York City. And in the early 1900s, basically 2 meals a week in New York City was consisting of just oysters. And New York City was consuming, on a per capita basis, 666 oysters. Per capita is how many oysters per year an individual consumes. So 666 oysters.
That's a lot of oysters.
Versus some other cities, just for context, London was consuming 60 oysters per capita a year.
Okay.
Just 60. And Paris was consuming 26.
Wow.
So we're talking hundreds of oysters were being consumed by people every year.
Yeah. In the US compared to other places.
Yes.
Easily 10 times more oysters.
Yes. Which is just, it's mind-blowing to me.
Yes. Yeah.
To think that at one point in time in the US, this many oysters were being eaten on a regular basis as a main food source.
Yeah. Yep. A primary protein.
Yes. Mind-blowing. Hey, Katie, remember that time that we wanted to start a podcast based on all of our random research conversations?
Yeah, and we had no idea what we were doing or how we would even make a podcast.
Yeah, that's the time. It was a really good thing we found Podbean, because that made it super easy to upload all of our episodes to multiple streaming platforms.
Podbean is a really simple platform for hosting and publishing your podcast.
So, if you and your best friend are having random conversations that you think should be a podcast, check out Podbean.
And if you do, use our link to get a month free. Podbean.com/obvious. That's PODBEAN.com/obvious.
And become super cool podcasters like us.
World famous. I just had no idea that the people were eating that many oysters, that there were so many oysters. And then something else that really piqued my interest is, if you remember from our restaurant episode, when we were talking about beginnings of restaurants in New York City, one type of establishment that preceded most other types of restaurants and could arguably be considered kind of the first restaurants in New York City, other than eating at a tavern or a hotel type situation, would be oyster cellars. So oyster cellars were extremely popular. They were also called oyster bars, oyster saloons, or oyster houses. They're often referred to as oyster cellars because they would set up in the basement or cellar area of a building, mostly because it was cooler and easier to keep them on ice. And these were sometimes also referred to as quote unquote dives, presumably because you might have to dive down the stairs kind of situation.
Out. Is that where we get dive bar from?
That's, I mean, it's one of the things that I read. It's at least one possible origin. So yeah.
Okay.
Oysters, all because of oysters. And oyster cellars were a really big fixture in New York City. I mean, other major cities of that time too, Boston, Philadelphia, but New York City was one of the big centers for this. And the first oyster cellar opened in New York City on Broad Street in 1763. So this is even far before this golden age of oysters that we're talking about. That cities like New York and Baltimore and Philadelphia, they had access to the oysters, so people who lived there were consuming them on a regular basis. And then obviously, like we talked about with the golden age of oysters, then it starts to infiltrate into other areas of the country as well. But yeah, so oyster cellars have been around for a long time. They were also sold as street food from just carts in the street. So there'd be someone with a cart of oysters just selling them. They became really popular with the working class who was looking for a quick lunchtime meal. Or, you know, just something to eat before they had to go back to work. But they were equally as popular with businessmen and upper class people who were looking for something to eat too. And the oyster cellars really reflected that. Some of them were really divey, as they say. And others were more upscale and more reputable. And in fact, some of the oyster cellars, or oyster saloons, I should say, because most of these places served alcohol with the oysters because it was just an easy pairing to make, right? But some of them that were the most divey, indicated it was an oyster cellar by the use of a red lantern or a red balloon, which was also a indicator of a brothel. And so some of these oyster cellars would be selling oysters and alcohol, and might be
sex,
a house of ill repute as well.
I mean, you get that aphrodisiac Aphrodite.
Playing the fact that they're supposedly an aphrodisiac or whatever, but also just that because they existed in many parts of the city, right? They existed in wealthier areas, but they also existed in like 5 Points, which was kind of the lowest class and the rough part of New York City at the time. But there were oyster cellars there too. So it just depended on kind of like what part of town you were in and what the establishment was like and how fancy or reputable. Huge span of what an oyster cellar could be.
Interesting.
Right? So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
And also was reading that a lot of these oyster cellars were owned and operated by African Americans. And in particular, there was a famous man who his oyster cellar was one of the most successful in New York City. His name was Thomas Downing. He was born free, but his parents were former slaves. And he did several different things in his early life, but eventually he opened up this oyster cellar in New York City on Broad Street in a basement apartment. And the way that he made it so successful was he would go out super early in the morning and actually row out to the oyster skiffs and talk to the captains and negotiate to be able to pick out the best oysters that they had harvested. Then the captains would bring in the oysters to the harbor, and he would be at the oyster market and he would bid against other people not to buy the oysters, but to just drive the price up for the captains.
Oh my God.
So he kind of had this nice little symbiotic relationship with the captains where like they gave him their best oysters and then he helped them drive the prices up.
And then he could undersell his because he had got them cheaper.
Yes.
Man, what a sneaky.
And he could also advertise that he had supposedly the best quality oysters, the biggest ones, whatever you want to say. So yeah, he was real smart about that. And then he also would invite those captains to his oyster cellar. So to stay on their good side, he'd be like, hey, come and eat at my oyster cellar.
Nice.
Have some of your catch.
Smart man right there.
Yeah. So his oyster cellar was also very upscale, and it became a very popular place for businessmen to come and eat oysters and discuss business. He also was one of the first people to allow women and children in his oyster cellars. So typically oyster cellars were targeted towards men and really only frequented by men. I mean, hence the brothel affiliation as well. But yeah, so he actually was very innovative at that time in saying that women and children could come as long as they were accompanied by their husband / father, right? They couldn't not by themselves. We don't want to get too crazy.
That's crazy. Yeah.
Don't want to get too crazy there. But yeah, the fact that he allowed them in was actually also unusual for those establishments. So he became known for several reasons. And when he died one of the wealthiest men in New York from his oyster cellar business.
That's crazy. Oh my gosh. I feel like, do you watch the show The Gilded Age? Because I feel like they need to have this man in the Gilded Age show. Holy cow.
Agreed. I was thinking the same thing. And
amazing.
And then also another little piece of history for his oyster cellar, but during the Civil War, it was also an underground railroad stop. So he would hide fleeing slaves who were on their way to Canada or other parts of the country in his oyster cellar, in his storerooms. So he's a very active abolitionist. Yeah, so I thought that was really a really neat little piece of restaurant history for you, the oyster cellar, especially oyster saloon.
I read that, so in New England and New York, speaking of what's considered to be the best oyster, is that in the northern parts of the US, what's considered to be the best oyster just has to do with the shape.
Really?
Yes.
Why?
Because
What?
back in this golden age of oysters, they made all these oyster plates that were very cute, right?
Yes.
And they're very cute little oyster plates. And so the better the oyster could fit in the little carved out things on the oyster plates, that was considered a more high quality oyster. So in New England, the quote unquote better quality oysters are ones that are shaped in a more rounded way, and that's literally the difference. It just has to do with shape.
They fit on the plate.
So they divide them out by shape, and so certain shapes are like tier 1 oysters, and then other shapes are like tier 2, and then tier 3, which I thought was interesting because that does not come into play in the Chesapeake area or further south in South Carolina or New Orleans. But yes, New England, they're very very concerned about the shapes
and their plates, fitting it on the plate properly.
Oh
my gosh, that's funny.
But yeah, the oyster industry was rocking in the 1800s, and honestly, I had no clue how crazy it was.
Yeah, I didn't either. And then I started to read about oyster pirates.
Yes. Yes.
And I was like, wait, what? Oyster pirates? Oh, yes. And Oyster Wars.
Yes.
Too.
Just when you think that it cannot get crazier, we were consuming millions of pounds of oysters a year. It gets crazier because people started fighting over them.
Yes. So if you have never heard of them, as I had not, the Oyster Wars were a series of disputes between the oyster pirates and local authorities, mostly from Maryland and Virginia, in the Chesapeake Bay and Potomac River. So what happened is, around 1830, Maryland passed some legislation that only allowed state residents to harvest oysters and also outlawed dredging. So that's what you were talking about.
The raking.
Raking, yeah. So being able to harvest tons of them at a time, right? They outlawed that. And then in 1865, they started requiring permits to harvest the oysters, which of course costs money. And that's considered the start of the Oyster Wars because naturally people were illegally fishing oysters and also illegally dredging. Yes. And then also, as you mentioned before, fishermen from New England started encroaching into the Chesapeake Bay to try to take oysters because their source was running out, which then caused sometimes violent clashes with the local fishermen or the local authorities. So the oyster pirates would be anybody who is illegally fishing the oysters. And in 1868, Maryland founded the Oyster Police Force, aka the Oyster Navy, which was responsible for enforcing the oyster laws. But that actually just kind of increased the whole oyster war scenario.
Yeah, because then it was like the pirates were fighting the oyster police.
So then also I was reading that Virginia waited a little bit longer to start putting some of these laws in place. So not until the 1870s, but then they also started imposing licensing fees, limits on how much you could harvest, and they also banned dredging in 1879. There were a couple of things that I read about specifically in Virginia. One, there were armed and organized dredgers who were actively violating the ban, and the then governor of Virginia was interested in increasing his popularity, and so he decided he was going to make an example out of these oyster pirates in order to gain favor. Yes. And so he launched this effort to take on these pirates and was successful in arresting and indicting 41 dredgers, and he captured 7 boats.
Oh, wow.
So it was a big deal for him, and he was also, I guess, the hero of the Oyster Wars at that point. Not long after, dredgers return. Okay, so people keep on doing it. And so he decides he's going to go after them again, but then he failed miserably, which also lost him a lot of political favor.
Couldn't do a repeat.
Right? So he did capture some of the pirates, but none of them were successfully indicted. They were released. And then the other thing that was like, oh my gosh, I was like chef's kiss to this. There was, in particular, a ship called the Dancing Molly that successfully outran him and evaded capture, and it was run by 3 women.
That's right. That's
3 women oyster pirates, and they
amazing.
Outran him and escaped the governor, and the press latched onto that and really had a heyday.
That's the real reason why he failed. He got outrun by 3 women pirates.
That's right. Yep.
In 65.
Yes. So, yeah, on the Dancing Molly.
Amazing.
That was my favorite Oyster War story.
Fantastic.
And also was shocked to learn that the Oyster Wars weren't really considered over until roughly 1959. Because illegal dredging
was
and
still
conflicts with people over that illegal dredging continued on until that time.
That's crazy.
It's a long ass war.
Yes.
That no one talks about.
The oyster police are definitely embedded into the history of the Chesapeake, though, and contemporary culture as well. I will share with the audience that I'm currently wearing a t-shirt that is an Oyster Police t-shirt that I obtained during a fundraiser for oyster and Chesapeake recovery, environmental recovery.
Oh my gosh.
So the Oyster Police are alive and well in the Chesapeake area.
I love it.
As a mythos. So actually, it's not that there are no Oyster Police anymore, but Maryland has now a Maryland Natural Resources Police, which came out of the Oyster Police. And
so they evolved.
Yes, the Oyster Police evolved into the Natural Resources Police that still exists in Maryland.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All from the Oyster Wars.
From the Oyster Wars.
I mean, I can't believe they don't cover this in my history class in high school. Like,
I mean, I feel like
a full war.
And also considering the fact that this was a major industry in the US.
Yeah.
Feels like this should have been brought up. It's crazy.
And now I need to name something after the Dancing Molly.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. For sure. This golden age of oysters was nuts, basically. So what ended up happening is actually kind of a bummer, to be honest. I felt like I was really bummed out about why all of this oyster consumption declined so much. Why we're not seeing this right now.
Here's the want part.
Yeah. Because I was like, if this was a main food source for people, what the heck happened? And basically what happened was a combination of several factors. One, the Food and Drug Administration happened. We talked a little bit about this in our condiment episode, but basically the Food and Drug Administration during the early 1900s, they passed some new health and safety acts for food consumption, which I'm not going to say we didn't need it.
They're such party poopers, though.
I know. We obviously needed it. I mean, don't read The Jungle and tell me that we didn't need it. But so one of the industries that they cracked down on, in addition to several meat producing industries, was the oyster industry. And probably because it was so huge, right?
Yeah.
People were consuming so much that they wanted to make sure that it was going to be safe. And in fairness, you can occasionally get a bad oyster that could make you sick. So they really cracked down on the oyster industry and introduced completely new health guidelines in order to make oyster consumption safer. Unfortunately, journalists sort of latched on to the health and safety concerns with the oyster industry and ran really far with oyster consumption being unsafe. They started linking basically every instance of typhoid fever outbreak to consuming oysters.
Why you gotta ruin it for everyone?
Right. And I'm not saying that maybe there wasn't some cases of typhoid that came from an oyster, but basically every time there was a typhoid outbreak, they would ask people if they had consumed an oyster, and then automatically were
Which
like,
they probably
the
had
typhoid was
because
from oysters.
everyone was eating oysters all the time.
Well, right. I mean, yeah. So they basically just started assuming that all instances of typhoid were from oyster consumption. And therefore, the oyster industry was so far, gone that they couldn't clean it up fast enough. And so people started not consuming oysters as much. 1907 is largely seen as Virginia's last big year of oyster harvesting, because the next year there was a big pollution scare. And so the water quality didn't meet these new guidelines that were put in place by the Food and Drug Administration. And so essentially the next year, none of the oysters were able to be harvested because they didn't meet these new guidelines. And so you go an entire year without being able to literally do anything. And it basically decimated the whole oyster industry in Virginia.
I read something similar for New York City too, that New York City was basically just dumping their wastewater into the harbor on a regular basis. And so the pollution reached a point where they felt it was no longer safe to eat those oysters around that same time too.
Yeah. And I mean, that's also fair, right? We had a lot more industrial runoff that was happening during this time frame, also tied to the railroads and other things like this that spurred the oyster production in the first place. And similar situation in Baltimore and other places in the Chesapeake because of the industry that existed here. There was pushback from the oyster industry. In 1911, in New Haven, which, as I mentioned, was another big area for oyster production, a group was started called the Oyster Growers and Dealers Association. And they tried to publish information about how the oyster industry was getting cleaned up. And, they were trying to follow the new guidelines and make sure that everything met what they needed to meet and it was safe again and people could start eating them again and it was good. But by that point, basically the damage had been done by the press. And so anything they published, people were like, no, thank you.
Yeah.
And the other thing that started happening too was that people started switching to consuming beef as their main protein source because of the growth of the Kansas City stockyards and again, the railroad industry growing that direction too.
Yep.
So people didn't need to consume oysters, I guess, because they could eat cows.
Millions of pounds.
So essentially, it just kind of died. Then we had Prohibition starting in the 1920s. And like you were saying before, a lot of oyster cellars were also bars where they were consuming alcohol. And so all of a sudden, people weren't going to those places because they weren't allowed to be selling alcohol. And so a lot of those went out of business during that time frame as well. And then to make matters worse, in the 1950s, there was an outbreak of a new oyster disease that happened in the Chesapeake. And the Chesapeake was still considered at that point the most productive oyster region in the country. But that oyster disease essentially decimated the Chesapeake oyster population. And so it just further crushed the entire Chesapeake region. It's a bummer. It's a bummer.
Sad.
I know. So it was like we went from this crazy consumption of oysters to like none.
Yes. And thus the golden age of oysters ended.
Yeah. And basically also that's why oyster plates, fun fact I read, pretty much all oyster plates and like dishes come from this golden age era. And that's why they're highly valued as like collector's items.
Interesting. Okay, I'll have to remember that next time I'm in an antique store.
See an oyster plate.
Yeah, take a look for an oyster plate.
So some facts about the oyster industry today. Today, the Gulf Coast is one of the larger oyster production regions. They produce about 7.8 million pounds of oysters. And then the Atlantic states as a whole, so that's a lot of states we're including in the Atlantic states as a whole, they produce 8.9 million pounds.
Okay, pause. Because let's just recall that between
Yes.
1880 and 1910, they were 160 million pounds of oyster. Like,
right.
It's just, I just want to draw attention
difference.
to that gap. Yeah,
yes.
that gap there.
Right. That's what I'm
Holy
saying.
crap.
Like, yeah, and then the Pacific region produces 4.5 million pounds.
Okay.
And that was all the numbers for 2023. So in 2023, we're looking at what? 21 million pounds of oysters being
Total.
Produced in the US versus in the 1880s, 160
million per year.
Yeah. It's
so
honestly
crazy.
nothing. It's honestly nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing.
It's like a drop in the bucket comparatively.
Yeah. It's nuts. Pretty much all oysters today are produced through aquaculture. So they're almost all of them farmed, not wild. And so globally, aquaculture production exceeds wild oyster harvests by a lot. Aquaculture production on a global scale is over 6 million tons of oysters versus natural oyster harvests are only 133,000 tons. So we're talking millions.
Yeah.
Aquaculture versus wild. Fun fact that I thought was interesting, even though most oysters are produced through aquaculture today, this old adage of only eating oysters in months that have an R in them still kind of holds true.
I've never heard of that. Tell me what is it?
So back in the day, people would say you should only harvest oysters in months that have an R. And so part of that had to do with the fact that in months with R's, it's easier to keep them cool because it's not as hot, right? Because basically we're looking at May through August don't have R's. And then September through April do have R's. Yep. So that is part of it. But also it has to do with species because the European species of oysters, the way that they grow, they don't produce a similar type of meat during months that don't have R's in them. But the US ones, that's not true, but it just came over from this European idea to not eat them with R's. But what is interesting is that the most sales of oysters in the US occur between November and February. So that's why you'll probably see a lot of oysters at the holidays and New Year's Eve and stuff like that. It's a very common sort of holiday food because that's traditionally when you would eat an oyster.
Yes, I actually read too, fun fact, that Thomas Downing, the oyster cellar owner I was talking about, is credited with coming up with the idea to make oyster stuffing for holiday birds.
That is fun.
And also, I know that this is kind of random, but I forgot I was going to tell you this. I was reading this article and I had like a Forrest Gump moment.
Yes, same. All of the different ways that you can eat oysters.
So I have to read this.
Yes.
Because I was like, all I could hear was like the shrimp gumbo, shrimp, shrimp. But it's oysters. So yeah, this article is from a New York Public Library blog, and it starts out: Blue Points, Saddle Rocks, Rockaways, Lynn Havens, Cape Cods, Buzzard Bays, Cottoots, Shrewsbury's raw on the half shell, fried oysters, oyster pie, oyster patties, oyster box stew, oysters pompadour, oysters Algonquin, oysters a la Netherland, a la Newburgh, a la Poulet, oysters roasted on toast, broiled in shell, served with cocktail sauce, stewed in milk or cream, fried with bacon, escalloped, fricasseed, and pickled. Like, never did I know there were so many ways to prepare oysters. Oh my God.
There's tons of ways to eat them.
Yep.
And some of it's like a little regional. I was reading that, so the oyster po' boy is a big food in African American foodways because of, again, going back to them supplementing their diet when they're enslaved. And bigger oysters are easier to fry and put into a sandwich and wouldn't have been as desirable to serve to wealthier people raw.
Yep.
Around here in Baltimore, a lot of people eat them char grilled. That's a common method of eating them.
Another fun tie back to our restaurant episode.
Yes.
Delmonico's in New York is credited with popularizing eating oysters on the half shell raw.
Okay.
So most of the oyster cellars and things like that, not that you do, you know, I'm sure they sometimes serve them raw, but a lot of times they were like roasted or cooked in some way, or one of those ways that I just listed off. But yeah, Delmonico's, that iconic first New York restaurant, served them raw.
Antoine's in New Orleans, which is also one of the oldest restaurants in the US, they are the ones that invented Oysters Rockefeller.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. But the other thing I think is really interesting is because oysters are found throughout the eastern US and in the South, there's not only a lot of different ways to prepare them, there's also different methods of opening them that involve different types of oyster knives and, you know, preferred methods. I'm not going to get into all the different oyster knives because it's kind of hard to explain some of them, but basically you can get knives that have longer or shorter blades, longer or shorter handles. Sometimes the handles will be like pear-shaped, whereas other handles will be more of like a bulb that you would hold onto. And then some of the blades will curve upwards so that you have less of a chance of poking the oyster and just getting the shell off.
Okay.
And some blades are better to use to open them from the side of the oyster, whereas some are better for opening from the front of the oyster. So every shucker is going to have their preferred method of opening and also their preferred blade type and handle type and way of opening them too.
Oyster culture. Who knew?
Who knew? And then the other interesting thing about oysters, because of them being grown all over the place, is they have different flavors. So while there are only 2 species of oysters in the US, you might be thinking, okay, but they don't all taste the same if you've eaten them. And that has to do with the locations that they're grown. So you might be familiar with drinking wine and how when people are drinking wine, they talk about the terroir of wine and how different grapes have different flavor based on the type of soil that they're grown in and the location that they're grown and how much sun they get and that sort of thing. The same is actually true for oysters. They call this the merroir of oysters because it has to do with maritime terroir, essentially. And so if oysters are grown in colder water versus warmer water, if they're grown in water that has a higher salinity content, like salt content, versus water that has a lower salt content, all of those will have an effect on how the oyster grows and also their size and their flavor. So I don't know what kind of oysters you prefer, but the kind of oyster I prefer is usually grown not directly on the coast, but usually higher up in the tributaries. So it has less salinity and it tends to be a little bit sweeter. And I personally think tastes more like a white button mushroom or something like that than
interesting. Yeah, I prefer
the ocean.
I guess I don't know how this translates to where they're grown, but I typically like oysters that are smaller in size and they also tend to be sweeter. I don't mind salinity. It's mostly the size. I don't like the big honkers.
So I would say, like, if you've only had an oyster that tastes like the ocean, look around for different types of oysters, and especially ones that maybe aren't grown on the coast, that are maybe grown up in like a tributary, because they won't have that same oceany salinity flavor as much as ones that are grown further up. So I think one of the things that is the most interesting to me about eating raw oysters is the different flavors that you'll get based on the geographic location that they're grown. Which brings me, of course, to why I eat oysters.
Yes. Please explain as the resident vegetarian.
Yes. If you are curious, there is actually a large debate within the vegan community on whether or not people should eat oysters. There is a subset of vegans that eat oysters called oyster vegans, essentially. So there are like quite a few that eat them. Basically, it comes back to an ethical debate. So I won't get into like the ethics of veganism. People can think what they want. I'm not trying to sway anyone one way or another. But essentially, what it boils down to is when you look at the complexity of an oyster as a being, they are not complex creatures.
Like less so than plants, right?
Basically, oysters do not have a central nervous system and they do not have a brain. And so because they don't have that, they cannot form thoughts and they cannot feel pain. So for some vegans, the reason why they become vegan is because they don't want to cause harm. And what that boils down to is whether or not a thing is sentient enough to be able to know that harm is being caused to it. And so therefore an oyster, if you follow along that logic, not having a nervous system or a brain, is incapable of knowing that they are being caused harm. And they also point to the fact that an oyster, when it plants onto a rock or whatever, it literally is stuck there their whole life. So there's no way in their mind that the oyster would know if it is being killed, if it can't flee or do anything at all to prevent that from happening to them, right? Whereas a clam could move away if something is happening to it. And then it gets into a lot of other things too. Like if we're looking at the nutrition of an oyster, they're very nutrient dense. They're a really low calorie source of protein. They are also a really good source of vitamin B12, iron, omega-3s, vitamin D, zinc, and selenium. They also are much lower in trace amounts of mercury than any other type of seafood. So they're very healthy and good for you to eat. The other thing that a lot of vegans care about is the farming culture. So oysters, because pretty much every oyster is produced through aquaculture in the world, it's a very sustainable food because they are essentially just taking these splats and putting them in the water, and then they're just existing in the water until they're big enough. We're not producing any other type of food source for them. Pigs, you have to produce corn in order to feed them, things like that. Like we're not doing that with oysters. We're literally just putting them there. They also have a really low carbon footprint, so they don't take any carbon.
They don't impact the environment.
Right. They're a non-invasive species. Well, and not only do they not impact the environment, they actually restore the environment. So a big thing that's going on right now, especially in some of these places that were very heavily affected by industrial runoff, like the Chesapeake Bay, like parts of New York City, Rhode Island, is they have these oyster recovery projects. And so what these projects do is they literally take these oyster splats and they put some of them in a farm for people to eat, and they put some of them into these polluted areas literally to clean up the water. So the irony of all of this stopping of oyster production back in the 1900s because the water was too polluted is that if they had just put oysters back in there, they would have helped to resolve the pollution that was happening in the water. So cultivating more oysters not only doesn't harm the environment or have any kind of negative carbon impact or anything like that, it actually improves what we have done to the environment. And so if you think about the ethical production of food sources, they're one of the best ones to be producing. And then the last thing that gets to vegans is because of the stance of vegans to do no harm, they think about things like when you are harvesting plants, how many secondary deaths are you causing in plant harvesting production? So if you think about like harvesting wheat and stuff, we've probably all watched Watership Down. You have a chance of killing field mice and other types of animals in those wheat harvesting and other like plant harvesting production facilities. So those would be known as secondary deaths. So how many deaths are you causing through that sort of production? With oysters, you're literally causing none.
Yeah.
There's no secondary deaths involved. These oysters are just living on a rope or whatever in some water, eating algae, and then you're pulling them out.
Yep.
So, you know, we can debate that. I mean, I'm not going to. It is definitely a huge debate in the vegan community for sure. I'll link an article in our show notes if you want to read more about it. But in terms of a protein source that is sustainable, ethical, good for the environment, you're not going to find something that's probably better than an oyster.
Right. The case for oysters.
So, I don't know. Am I saying that we should go back to the golden age?
Yes, I was just going to say, we need an oyster renaissance.
Yeah, we do. I mean, I think that there are groups out there, I know especially in the Chesapeake with the Oyster Recovery Project and the Chesapeake Bay Alliance and things like that, there are groups that are really trying to reinvigorate the oyster population. So I know that it is on the table. Whether or not that will grow into a huge food industry, I don't know. Maybe our palates have changed too much as a society to go back to consuming that many oysters. But
oysters are kind of a divisive food now. Like some people are like, ew, gross, I would never that. And then some people like love them and eat a ton of them.
There's so many ways to prepare them, though.
Right?
I mean, how many ways have you tried?
Do I need to go over the list again?
Yeah, but this was a fun rabbit hole to go down, I feel.
It was.
Because
there it is. There's the reference.
I was honestly shocked at the sheer volume of harvesting and consumption of oysters.
Me too. Yep. And an entire oyster war situation that I had no clue was going on. An oyster navy. And also just to finish with another little idiom fact.
Ooh.
You said the world is your oyster at the beginning.
Oh, yes. The world is our oyster.
Yeah, that's actually a saying that was created by Shakespeare. Yeah, I didn't know that was a Shakespeare writing.
I didn't either. Is it like a all the world's a stage sort of thing that he did that too?
Yeah, well, yeah. And the idea too was that a nice fresh oyster could be hard to open, but once opened, it's good and maybe even has a pearl in it. So
fun.
The world is your oyster. Shakespeare strikes again. And idioms all day, every day.
All day, every day.
Yeah.
We got two idioms of the week in this episode.
Yes, I know. Probably more when we listen back to it, too.
Probably.
We probably said other things as well.
Thank you for listening to Researching the Obvious. To learn more fun facts about everything that we're researching, follow us on Instagram at Researching the Obvious Pod, all one word. You can also follow us on Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you know someone that you think would enjoy listening to all of our findings, please feel free to share or give us a review. Researching the Obvious is written, produced, edited, and hosted by Emily Fekete and Katie Nakanishi. Tune in next time to hear more obvious facts.